Sometimes life takes everything from you in a single moment, leaving you to wonder if you'll ever feel whole again. For Margaret Brennan, that moment came 10 years ago when a rare nerve disorder stole not just her ability to walk, but her will to live. At 53, she spent her days alone in a small apartment, cut off from the music and joy that once filled her heart. But on a quiet afternoon in November, she rolled her wheelchair into St. Margaret's Cathedral, where she'd worshipped as a child. A newly restored Virgin Mary statue stood in the corner, peaceful and serene. When Margaret reached out and touched the statue's marble foot, something happened that doctors couldn't explain. What she discovered would change everything she believed about healing and hope. But what happened next would transform not just her life, but everyone around her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dusty piano stood like a monument to dreams deferred, its mahogany surface hidden beneath white sheets that had yellowed with time. Margaret Brennan could still remember the day they'd covered it, 3 months after the accident, when it became clear she wouldn't be returning to the Victorian house on Maple Street, where she'd taught piano for 15 years. That was her old life. The life where children's laughter echoed through high-ceilinged rooms, where tiny fingers stumbled through scales while she guided them with patient encouragement. Where she'd been someone, Margaret Brennan, beloved piano teacher, mother of 2, pillar of the community. Now she was simply the woman in 2B who paid her rent on time and rarely made noise. Her apartment above Murphy's laundromat was a study in efficient living, 800 square feet that contained everything she owned: a hospital bed, a small kitchenette, bookshelves lined with music theory texts she no longer opened, and the wheelchair that had become her constant companion. The walls were thin, enough that she could hear the washing machine spinning stories of other people's lives, busy families, working mothers, teenagers learning independence. From her window, she watched the world move with purpose while she remained stationary. School children walked past each morning, backpacks bouncing, their chatter a reminder of the students she'd once known. Occasionally, she'd spot a former pupil, now grown, hurrying to jobs or pushing strollers. They never looked up. Her son David lived in Portland now, a software engineer with good intentions and a busy schedule. Their monthly phone calls had dwindled to holiday check-ins, conversations filled more with guilt than genuine connection. "I should visit more, Mom," he'd say, and she'd assure him she was fine, that he had his own life to live. At 28, he deserved happiness without the weight of her circumstances. Susan, her younger child, had moved to Denver after finishing nursing school. She called more frequently, but Margaret could hear the strain in her voice, the careful tone healthcare workers used with difficult patients. At 25, Susan carried responsibility like a stone in her chest, always asking about medications, doctor appointments, whether Margaret was eating enough. Love wrapped in clinical concern. The worst part wasn't the wheelchair. It wasn't even the constant ache in her lower back or the medications that fogged her thoughts. It was the silence. The apartment absorbed sound like a tomb. No footsteps on stairs, no rustling of sheet music, no melody spilling from eager young fingers discovering Chopin for the first time. Mrs. O'Brien, her elderly neighbor from across the hall, was her primary connection to the outside world. Twice a week, the 80-year-old Irish woman would knock with groceries and gossip from the street. "The Kowalski boy got into college," she'd report. Or, "Father Rodriguez is starting a new program for seniors." Margaret would nod and smile, grateful for the company while simultaneously exhausted by the effort of appearing interested. Her disability income covered basic needs, rent, utilities, medical expenses, but left little room for extras. The insurance settlement from the accident had paid off the house before she sold it, leaving her with enough savings to feel secure but not comfortable. She'd cancelled the cable television subscription, finding the constant stream of other people's drama too much to bear. Instead, she listened to classical music on an old radio, volume low, so as not to disturb the neighbors she rarely saw. Doctor appointments punctuated her weeks like milestones on a desolate highway. Physical therapy twice monthly. Though progress had plateaued years ago, neurology visits every 3 months, where Dr. Stevens would review her charts with the same carefully neutral expression, asking the same questions about sensation and pain levels. The answers never changed. At night, when the laundromat finally quieted and the building settled into sleep, Margaret would lie awake, listening to her own heartbeat. Sometimes she'd remember pieces she'd loved to play, Debussy's Clair de Lune or Bach's Prelude in C major, and her fingers would move silently against the bedsheets, muscle memory intact even when everything else had failed. She'd lost touch with Patricia Walsh 3 years after the accident. Her best friend since high school had tried, visiting weekly at first, then monthly, bringing flowers and forced cheerfulness. But Margaret had been drowning then, pulling everyone down with her bitterness and rage. When Patricia's visit stopped, Margaret felt both relief and devastating loneliness. The piano in her old house haunted her dreams. Sometimes she'd wake convinced she could still feel the smooth ivory keys beneath her fingertips, hear the resonance of strings vibrating through the wooden body. Then reality would crash back. The narrow bed, the whir of industrial washers below, the weight of another empty day stretching ahead. Her morning routine rarely varied. Coffee first, black and strong enough to cut through the fog of sleep medications. Check the weather from her window, though it rarely influenced her plans. Review the bottle of pills arranged on her nightstand. Pain management, muscle relaxants, antidepressants that helped her sleep, but left her feeling hollow during waking hours. She'd tried reading, but concentration had become elusive. Television felt like watching life through glass, bright and distant, nothing to do with her grey existence. The radio provided background noise, classical stations that played pieces she'd once taught, creating a bittersweet soundtrack to her solitude. Meals were simple affairs. Sandwiches, canned soup, frozen dinners she could prepare without leaving her chair. Mrs. O'Brien had offered to cook for her, but Margaret couldn't bear the kindness. It felt too much like charity, too much like admitting defeat. The wheelchair had been her enemy at first, a daily reminder of everything she'd lost. Now it was simply a tool, as neutral as a pair of glasses or a hearing aid. She'd learned to navigate curbs and doorways, to reach high shelves and low cabinets. Her upper body had grown stronger, while her legs remained stubbornly silent. On particularly difficult days, when the walls seemed to press closer and the silence grew too heavy, she'd consider calling David or Susan. But what would she say? That she was lonely? That some mornings she couldn't find a reason to get out of bed? They carried enough worry already. The accident itself had become less important over time than its aftermath. A drunk driver, a moment of impact, months in. The hospital, details that mattered less than the slow realization that her old life was over and no new life was beginning. She'd simply stopped, like a clock whose spring had wound down. Sometimes she wondered if this was her penance for some unknown sin, if she deserved the isolation and struggle. Other times she felt angry at God, at fate, at the cosmic unfairness that had stolen her purpose and left her warehoused like furniture in storage. But on this grey November afternoon, something stirred. Maybe it was the way the light fell across her windowsill, or the memory of a hymn playing on the radio. Maybe it was simply that she couldn't stand another day of her own company. Whatever the reason, Margaret Brennan looked at her coat hanging by the door and made a decision that would change everything. The communion photograph had lived in Margaret's wallet for 45 years, its edges soft with handling. A 7-year-old girl in white lace, hands clasped in prayer before the altar of St. Margaret's Cathedral. She'd pulled it out 3 times during the bus ride downtown, studying the face of a child who'd believed in miracles without question. The cathedral had changed little in the decades since that first communion. Gothic spires still reached toward heaven, and stained glass. Windows cast rainbow patterns across stone floors, worn smooth by generations of faithful footsteps. But the neighborhood around it had transformed. Trendy coffee shops replaced corner groceries, and young professionals walked quickly past the homeless men who gathered near the entrance. Margaret's wheelchair bumped slightly as she rolled through the heavy wooden doors. The familiar scent of incense and old wood enveloped her, triggering memories so vivid she had to pause and breathe deeply. Here she'd been baptized, confirmed, married. Here she'd brought David and Susan for their own first communions, watching them fidget in their formal clothes while she beamed with pride from the pews. The afternoon mass had ended, leaving the cathedral nearly empty, except for a few elderly parishioners lighting candles and a young priest arranging flowers near the altar. Soft organ music drifted from the choir loft, where someone was practicing for Sunday service. Margaret recognized the piece, Ave Maria, and felt something stir in her chest that she'd thought was dead. She rolled slowly down the center aisle, her wheels silent on the stone floor. Everything felt larger than she remembered, as if her wheelchair had shrunk her to child size again. The vaulted ceiling soared overhead, and Christ's suffering gaze from the crucifix above the altar seemed to follow her movement. "Can I help you with anything?" The voice was gentle, accented with the rhythm of someone whose first language wasn't English. Margaret turned to see the young priest approaching, mid-30s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and prematurely grey hair at his temples. "I'm just visiting," she said, surprised by how rusty her voice sounded. "I haven't been here in a long time." "I'm Father Rodriguez," he said, extending his hand. "I've only been here 2 years, so I'm still meeting parishioners. I don't think we've been introduced." "Margaret Brennan. I grew up here, but I don't really attend anymore." She shook his hand, noting the calluses that suggested he worked with his hands outside of religious duties. "Well, you're always welcome. Are you familiar with our restoration project?" He gestured toward the left side of the cathedral, where scaffolding surrounded what appeared to be a statue under protective cloth. "Restoration project?" Father Rodriguez's face lit up with enthusiasm. "We've been working for 18 months to restore our Virgin Mary statue. She's been here since 1887, but time and weather had damaged her badly. The Archdiocese approved. The funds for a complete restoration, structural repair, cleaning, even some missing fingers that were replaced by a master craftsman from Italy." Margaret followed his gesture to where the covered statue stood in an alcove that had been empty during her last visit years ago. "I don't remember a statue there. She was moved to storage in the 1990s when the damage became too extensive. But the community raised additional funds, and last week we finally brought her home." Pride warmed his voice. "Would you like to see her? We're unveiling her officially on Sunday, but I don't think she'd mind an early visitor." Something in his tone, respect, mixed with genuine affection, made Margaret nod. She followed him toward the alcove, noting how the afternoon light streaming through the stained glass windows seemed to pool exactly where the statue waited. Father Rodriguez carefully pulled away the protective cloth, revealing a figure of breathtaking beauty. The Virgin Mary stood with arms slightly outstretched, her face tilted downward with an expression of infinite compassion. The marble had been cleaned to reveal subtle variations in color, cream and ivory, and the faintest suggestion of pink in her cheeks. Her robes flowed in realistic folds, and her bare feet rested on a simple base carved with roses. "She's beautiful," Margaret whispered, and meant it. There was something about the statue's expression, not pity or sorrow, but understanding, as if she'd witnessed every human struggle and found them all worthy of love. "The craftsman who restored her told me something interesting," Father Rodriguez said, his voice dropping slightly. "This particular statue was carved by a man whose own daughter was paralyzed in a riding accident. He put something of his own, a faith into the marble, not just skill, but hope." Margaret felt her breath catch. She rolled closer, studying the intricate details. The sculptor had captured something beyond mere beauty. There was presence here, a sense of patient waiting, of arms ready to embrace anyone who approached. The community has so much faith in her, Father Rodriguez continued. Mrs. Kowalski comes every morning to pray for her arthritis. The Valdez family lights candles for their son serving overseas. People find comfort here. Do you believe she performs miracles? The question surprised Margaret. She hadn't planned to ask it. Father Rodriguez considered carefully. I believe God works through many channels. Sometimes healing comes through medicine, sometimes through community, sometimes through changes. We can't see or measure. Miracles aren't always what we expect them to be. Margaret nodded, though she wasn't sure she agreed. If miracles were real, wouldn't she have experienced one by now? 10 years of prayers, of hope, of desperate bargaining with a God who seemed to have forgotten her address. I should let you have some private time, Father Rodriguez said gently. I'll be in the sacristy if you need anything. Alone with the statue, Margaret felt suddenly self-conscious. What was she doing here? What had she expected to find? She looked up at the Virgin's serene face and felt old anger stirring. Where had this compassion been when she'd needed it most? Where was the miracle for the piano teacher whose music had been silenced? But as she sat there, something began to shift. Maybe it was the late afternoon light warming the marble, or the distant sound of organ practice creating a sacred soundtrack. Maybe it was simply exhaustion from carrying her bitterness for so long. Whatever the reason, Margaret found herself reaching out. Her fingertips touched the statue's bare foot, cool marble worn smooth by countless other hands. She didn't pray, didn't ask for anything specific. She simply sat in the presence of something larger than her anger, older than her pain. The sensation was subtle at first, a warmth that seemed to spread from the marble through her fingers, up her arm, settling somewhere near her heart. Not physical healing, nothing dramatic or mystical, just a quieting of the noise in her mind, a momentary peace she hadn't felt in years. She sat like that for nearly an hour, her hand resting against the statue's foot, while the cathedral grew darker around her. Other parishioners came and went, their footsteps echoing softly, but no one disturbed her vigil. When she finally withdrew her hand, something had changed. Not in her legs, which remained stubbornly numb, but in the weight she'd carried in her chest. That night, in her narrow bed above the laundromat, Margaret dreamed of music for the first time in a decade. Not the painful memories that usually haunted her sleep, but something new, a melody she'd never heard before. Complex and beautiful, played by hands she couldn't see on a piano that gleamed like polished light. She woke with tears on her cheeks, and the echo of that impossible music still ringing in her ears. The sheet music collection filled 3 cardboard boxes in Margaret's closet, each piece carefully preserved in protective sleeves. She hadn't looked at them in 5 years, but this morning, the morning after her dream of impossible music, she found herself pulling them out with hands that trembled slightly. Bach's Prelude in C major, Chopin's Minute Waltz, simple arrangements of children's songs like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, and Mary Had a Little Lamb. Each piece told a story of patient afternoons spent guiding small fingers across keys, of recitals where nervous children transformed into confident musicians under her encouragement. She spread the sheets across her bed, studying notation that had once been as familiar as her own handwriting. Her fingers moved unconsciously, playing invisible melodies against the wheelchair's armrests. Muscle memory, it seemed, outlasted everything else. The radio played softly in the background, a Beethoven sonata she'd taught to dozens of students. Over the years, without thinking, she began humming along, then singing the melody line in a voice rusty from disuse. It felt like stretching muscles that had been cramped too long. When her phone rang, she almost didn't answer. Monthly calls from David rarely brought good news, usually requests for her to consider assisted living or questions about her medical care that made her feel like a burden rather than his mother. "Hi, Mom." His voice carried the familiar note. Of dutiful concern, David. She surprised herself by smiling. How are you? I'm fine. Work's busy. Sarah's pregnant again. He paused, as if waiting for her to process the information. We wanted you to know you'll be a grandmother for the second time. Margaret felt something unlock in her chest. Joy, pure and unexpected. Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful news. How is she feeling? Better than last time? Less morning sickness? David sounded cautious, as if he wasn't sure how to navigate his mother expressing genuine happiness. The baby's due in June. June. Margaret found herself calculating, planning. Will you need help? I know it's difficult with two small children. Silence stretched between them. David cleared his throat. Mum, you know we appreciate the offer, but I know I can't physically help the way I'd like to, Margaret said gently. But there are other ways to support a family. I could teach little Andrew piano when he's older. I still remember how. You do? The surprise in his voice stung, but she understood it. For years, she'd been the mother who never mentioned music, who'd packed away every reminder of her former life. I've been thinking about it lately, about teaching again. Mom, that's... David paused, searching for words. That's great, really great. I just didn't know you were interested in that anymore. Neither did I until recently. Margaret looked at the sheet music scattered around her bed. I've been feeling more like myself lately. Does that make sense? It does. David's voice softened. I've been worried about you being so isolated. Have you made any friends, found anything to do during the day? She almost mentioned the cathedral, the statue, the strange sense of peace she'd found there. But that felt too fragile to share, too precious to risk his well-meaning concern. I'm exploring some options. Nothing definite yet. They talked for another 20 minutes, the longest conversation they'd had in years. David told her about his work, his promotion, little Andrew's first words. Margaret found herself laughing at his stories, offering advice about toddler behavior, feeling like a mother instead of a patient for the first time in a decade. After hanging up, she sat in the strange silence of her apartment, but it felt different. Now, less heavy, more full of possibility. She picked up a simple arrangement of Amazing Grace and began to hum, then sing, letting her voice grow stronger with each verse. Mrs. O'Brien knocked around noon, carrying her usual bag of groceries and local gossip. But when she entered the apartment, she stopped short, her sharp eyes taking in the sheet music covering every surface. Well now, the elderly woman said, setting down her bag. What's all this then? My old teaching materials, Margaret said, feeling suddenly shy. I was just looking through them. Mrs. O'Brien picked up a children's songbook, her weathered fingers tracing the colorful cover. I remember when my Patrick was learning piano. Terrible at it he was, but his teacher was so patient, made him feel like he could do anything. She looked up at Margaret with knowing eyes. You taught piano? For 15 years. Before? Margaret gestured vaguely at her wheelchair. Before what? Your hands stop working? Your brain forget how music goes? Mrs. O'Brien's tone was brisk, but not unkind. Seems to me those are the parts that matter most in teaching. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. It's not that simple. Students need someone who knows what they're talking about and gives a damn whether they learn it right. Mrs. O'Brien sat down in the apartment's single chair, clearly settling in for a longer conversation. My neighbor's granddaughter is 8 years old, bright as a penny, and her mother's been looking for a piano teacher for months. All the good ones have waiting lists longer than my grocery receipts. I couldn't possibly. Why not? You got someplace else to be, something more important to do. Mrs. O'Brien's eyes sparkled with mischief. Besides, seems like God might be nudging you in this direction, what with all this music spread around. Like autumn leaves. Margaret looked around her apartment, seeing it suddenly through Mrs. O'Brien's eyes, sheet music everywhere, the radio playing classical pieces, her own hands unconsciously moving to invisible rhythms. Maybe the old woman was right. Maybe this stirring she'd been feeling wasn't nostalgia, but possibility. I don't have a piano, Margaret said weakly. The community center's got one. St. Margaret's has one in the parish hall. Plenty of pianos. In this world, if you know where to look. Mrs. O'Brien stood, brushing imaginary dust from her coat. I'll mention to Mrs. Kowalski that I know someone who might be interested in teaching young Lily. She's a good woman. Pays her bills on time. After Mrs. O'Brien left, Margaret sat surrounded by her musical past and tried to imagine a different future. Teaching again, sharing the joy of discovery with a new generation of students. It seemed impossible and inevitable at the same time. That afternoon, she made a decision that surprised her. She called information and asked for the number of St. Margaret's Cathedral. Father Rodriguez, this is Margaret Brennan. I was there yesterday, and you mentioned the parish hall has a piano? The teaching certificate hung in a simple black frame, slightly faded, but still bearing the official seal of the American Music Teachers Association. Margaret had earned it 23 years ago, fresh out of college and eager to share her love of music with the world. She'd kept it in storage with other remnants of her former life, but now it sat on her kitchen table while she considered whether she still had the right to call herself a teacher. Father Rodriguez had been enthusiastic when she'd called about using the parish hall piano. It's a beautiful old Steinway baby grand, he'd said, donated by the Morrison family when they moved to Florida. We use it for choir practice and the occasional wedding, but it sits empty most days. You'd be doing us a favor by keeping it in use. That had been 3 days ago. 3 days of Margaret staring at the certificate and wondering if she was fooling herself. Could someone who hadn't taught in a decade, who could barely navigate her own emotional landscape, guide a child through the complexities of musical education? This morning she'd finally worked up the courage to visit Rosie's Cafe on Main Street. The small coffee shop had opened 2 years ago in a converted bookstore, its mismatched furniture and local artwork creating the kind of cozy atmosphere that invited lingering conversations. Margaret had wheeled past it countless times during her rare outings, but never ventured inside. The young man behind the counter, Jake, according to his name tag, greeted her with genuine warmth rather than the careful politeness she'd grown accustomed to receiving. He was perhaps 30, with paint-stained fingers and the kind of creative energy that seemed to vibrate around him like heat waves. "First time in?" he asked, already reaching for a coffee cup. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee, black, please." Margaret maneuvered her wheelchair to a table near the window, grateful that the cafe had been designed with accessibility in mind. As Jake prepared her drink, she overheard a conversation at the next table. A woman, about her own age, was talking. On her phone, frustration clear in her voice. "I've called 6 different music teachers, and they all have waiting lists. Lily's been asking for piano lessons for months, and I promised her we'd find someone before Christmas." The woman paused, listening. "I know it's expensive, but she's so interested in music. I just want to encourage that." Margaret felt her heart rate quicken. Without allowing herself time to reconsider, she turned slightly toward the woman. "Excuse me, I couldn't help overhearing. Are you looking for a piano teacher for your daughter?" The woman looked up, hope flickering in her tired eyes. "Yes, actually. Do you know someone?" "I am someone, or I was. I taught piano for 15 years. Margaret felt heat creep up her neck. "I'm just getting back into teaching, but if you're interested in having Lily try a lesson or two—" "Really?" The woman's face brightened. "I'm Jennifer Burke. And yes, I'd be very interested. Lily's 8, and she's been teaching herself songs on this little keyboard we bought her. She's got a good ear, but I think she needs proper instruction." They exchanged information, and Jennifer promised to call that evening to set up a trial lesson. After she left, Margaret sat in stunned silence, hardly believing what she'd just done. She'd committed to teaching again. Not in some distant future, but next week. Jake appeared at her table with a warm scone. "On the house," he said with a grin. "Couldn't help overhearing that conversation. That was pretty brave of you." "Brave. Or stupid," Margaret muttered, but she found herself smiling. "Probably both. That's how most good things start." Jake pulled out the chair across from her. "Mind if I sit for a minute? It's slow this afternoon." Margaret nodded, surprised by how comfortable she felt with this young man she'd just met. There was something unpretentious about him, an easiness that invited confidence. "I've been struggling with getting back into something I used to love too," Jake said, gesturing around the cafe. "This place is my attempt at combining art and commerce. I'm a painter, but you can't exactly live on art sales in a town this size. So coffee shop by day, studio by night. Is it working? Some days better than others. But I figure if you don't try, you definitely won't succeed." He studied her with curious eyes. "What made you decide to start teaching again?" Margaret considered the question, surprised by her own honesty when she answered, "I think I forgot that I was more than my limitations. Music was such a big part of who I was, and when I lost the ability to play regularly, I thought I'd lost everything. But maybe teaching is another way to stay connected to something I love." "That makes sense." Jake glanced at his watch and stood. "I should get back to work, but I hope your first lesson goes well. And hey, if you ever need to practice or just want to play for yourself, I've got an old upright in the back room. It's not much, but it's tuned and the keys all work." That evening, Jennifer called as promised. Lily, she explained, was a serious child who approached everything with intense focus. She'd been asking for piano lessons since her 6th birthday, saving her allowance money in a jar marked music fund. The family could afford lessons, but had been frustrated by the lack of available teachers. "Would Saturday afternoon work for you?" Jennifer asked. "I could bring Lily to wherever you'd like to meet." Margaret looked around her cramped apartment, then thought of the beautiful Steinway waiting in the parish hall. "Actually, I teach at St. Margaret's Cathedral. The parish hall has a wonderful piano, and I think Lily might enjoy the setting." They agreed on Saturday at 2 o'clock, giving Margaret 3 days to prepare. 3 days to remember how to be a teacher instead of just someone who used to teach. That night, she called Father Rodriguez to confirm the arrangement. "Of course," he said warmly. "In fact, if this goes well, would you consider posting a notice on our community board? We have several families looking for music instruction." After hanging up, Margaret realized she'd committed to more than just one trial lesson. Word would spread, as it did in small communities. If she did well with Lily, other students would follow. If she failed, everyone would know that too. She spent the evening reviewing her old teaching materials, remembering techniques for working with young students. Patience, encouragement, making music feel like play rather than work. Start with simple songs they already knew, build confidence before introducing challenges. Always end on a positive note, literally and figuratively, but as she prepared for bed, a memory surfaced that made her pause. Kevin Morrison, age 7, her most challenging student ever. He'd had attention problems and small hands that struggled to span the keys, but he'd loved music with a passion that overcame every obstacle. She'd adapted her teaching methods, found ways to make lessons engaging for his quick mind and restless energy. By the end of the year, Kevin was playing simple Bach inventions and composing his own melodies. At his final recital before his family moved away, he dedicated his performance to Mrs. Brennan, who never gave up on me. If she could reach Kevin Morrison, maybe she could still teach. Maybe some abilities, once developed, never truly disappeared. They just waited for the right moment to resurface. The metronome had belonged to Margaret's first piano teacher, Mrs. Goldman, who'd passed it down like a sacred relic, along with stern advice about keeping proper time. "Music without rhythm is just noise," the elderly woman had declared. And Margaret had carried that wisdom through 15 years of teaching her own students. Now, as she retrieved the brass metronome from a dusty box in her closet, she wondered if she still had the rhythm to guide another generation. Saturday arrived with surprising speed. Margaret had spent the morning reviewing simple pieces and arranging sheet music in the parish hall, trying to create a welcoming learning environment despite her nervousness. The Steinway gleamed under the afternoon light, streaming through tall windows, its ebony surface reflecting the stained glass patterns from the adjacent cathedral. Lily Peterson arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, a serious 8-year-old with blonde braids and eyes that studied everything with intense curiosity. She walked quietly beside her mother, but Margaret noticed how her gaze immediately found the piano and stayed there with unmistakable longing. "This is a beautiful piano," Lily said softly, approaching the instrument as if it were a sleeping giant she didn't want to disturb. "It is, indeed," Margaret agreed, rolling her wheelchair to the bench. "Would you like to touch the keys, just to hear the sound?" Lily looked to her mother for permission, then pressed middle C with one finger. The pure tone filled the hall, and Margaret saw the child's face light up with wonder. This was what she'd been missing. That moment when a student connected with music, when possibilities sparked in young eyes. "Do you know any songs?" Margaret asked, patting the bench beside her wheelchair. "I can play Happy Birthday and Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star," Lily said, climbing onto the bench. "I taught myself on my keyboard at home." "Show me Twinkle, Twinkle." Lily played the simple melody with one finger, her timing uncertain, but her ear clearly developed. Margaret listened, noting the child's natural musical instincts and the way she leaned into the piano as if trying to absorb its vibrations. "That was lovely," Margaret said. "Would you like to learn how to play it with both hands?" For the next 45 minutes, Margaret rediscovered the joy of teaching. Lily was an eager student, absorbing instruction with the focus her mother had described. Together, they worked through basic finger positioning, simple scales, and a two-handed arrangement of the familiar children's song. Margaret found herself adapting instinctively to teaching from her wheelchair, angling herself so she could demonstrate fingerings and reach the keys when necessary. The physical limitations that had seemed insurmountable in her imagination proved manageable in practice. Her hands still remembered how to guide small fingers. Her voice still knew how to encourage, without overwhelming. "Can I come back next week?" Lily asked as the lesson ended, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "If your mother agrees, I'd love to continue working with you," Margaret replied, surprised by how much she meant it. Jennifer Peterson was effusive in her gratitude. "I haven't seen Lily this excited about anything in months. You have a gift with children." After they left, Margaret sat alone in the parish hall, her hands resting on the piano keys. The silence felt different now, not empty, but full of potential. She played a few scales, then launched into a piece she hadn't attempted in years, Debussy's Clair de Lune. Her fingers stumbled at first, but muscle memory gradually returned, and soon the delicate melody filled the space with haunting beauty. Father Rodriguez appeared in the doorway as she finished, applauding softly. "That was beautiful. How did the lesson go?" "Better than I expected," Margaret admitted. "Much better. I'm glad to hear it. Would you mind if I posted a notice about your teaching on our community board? I've had several inquiries about music. Instruction." That evening, Margaret's phone rang. She expected it to be David or Susan checking in, but the voice on the other end was unfamiliar, warm, tentative, with a slight tremor of age. "Is this Margaret Brennan? I heard from Mrs. O'Brien that you might be teaching piano again." "Yes, I'm just starting to take students. May I ask who's calling?" "This is Patricia Kowalski. We knew each other years ago. I was Patricia Hammond then, before I married Stanley." Margaret's breath caught. Patricia, her best friend from high school, maid of honor at her wedding, godmother to both her children. The woman who'd tried so hard to maintain their friendship after the accident, who'd finally stopped visiting when Margaret's bitterness became too toxic to bear. "Patricia," Margaret whispered, "how did you— it's been so long." "Mrs. O'Brien mentioned you might be teaching Lily Burke. She's my granddaughter." Patricia's voice was careful, testing the waters. "I've been living with Jennifer and Lily since Stanley passed 2 years ago." The coincidence felt like something beyond chance, as if invisible threads were weaving Margaret back into a community she'd abandoned. "I'm sorry about Stanley. He was a good man. He was." "Thank you." Patricia paused. "Margaret, would it be possible for us to talk? I mean, really talk? I know things ended badly between us, and I've regretted how I handled everything. But when I heard you were teaching again..." They arranged to meet the next afternoon at Rosie's cafe. Margaret spent a sleepless night wondering what she would say to the friend she'd pushed away during her darkest period. Patricia had been her closest confidant, the person who'd known her dreams and fears, who'd celebrated her triumphs and mourned her losses. Their friendship's end had been one of the casualties Margaret mourned most deeply, even as she'd been unable to prevent it. The next day, Margaret arrived at the cafe early, positioning herself at a corner table where she could see the entrance. When Patricia walked in, Margaret's heart clenched with recognition and grief. Her friend had aged, silver threading through brown hair and lines mapping the years Margaret had missed. But her smile was the same. Warm, slightly mischievous, instantly familiar. "You look good," Patricia said, settling into the chair across from Margaret. "I mean that. You look like yourself again." "I feel more like myself lately," Margaret admitted, "though I'm not sure I deserve to after how I treated you." "Stop!" Patricia's voice was firm. "We both made mistakes. I should have been more patient. Should have understood that grief isn't linear or predictable. Instead, I got frustrated when you didn't heal on my timeline." They talked for 2 hours, filling in the years of separation. Patricia's marriage to Stanley Kowalski, their quiet life running the family bakery until his retirement, his battle with cancer, the decision to move in with Jennifer when living alone became too difficult, her pride in granddaughter Lily, her joy at seeing the child's musical talents emerging. "I wanted to help you so badly after your accident," Patricia said, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "But I didn't know how, and when you pushed me away, I let myself believe that meant you didn't need me anymore." "I needed you more than ever," Margaret replied. "I just didn't know how to accept help without feeling like I was drowning in pity." And now, Margaret considered the question, thinking of the past week, the dream of music, the touch of marble, the joy of teaching Lily. "Now I think maybe I'm ready to be helped, and to help others too." As they prepared to leave, Patricia reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "Would you like to come to dinner next Sunday? Jennifer's making her famous pot roast, and Lily would love to show you what she's been practicing." Walking back to her apartment, rolling back, she corrected herself with a wry smile. Margaret felt something she'd almost forgotten: anticipation for the future. A student who brought joy to teaching, a friendship being rebuilt, a community that was welcoming her back with open arms. That evening, 3 more parents called about piano lessons. The prayer candle flickered in its red glass holder, casting dancing shadows across the pew where Margaret sat in late afternoon quiet. She'd been lighting one each week since her first visit to see the Virgin Mary statue, not entirely sure what she was praying for, but knowing that the act itself brought comfort. The small flame seemed to represent something. Hope, perhaps, or simply the acknowledgement that some forces in life were larger than human understanding. Sunday dinner at Patricia's daughter's house had been a revelation. Jennifer Burke's home was warm and chaotic in the best possible way, Lily practicing piano in the living room while her younger brother built elaborate block towers, the scent of pot roast and fresh bread filling the air, conversation flowing easily around the dinner table. Margaret had felt like part of a family again, included rather than accommodated, valued rather than pitied. "Tell me about your other students," Patricia had asked over dessert, genuine interest lighting her eyes. Margaret had found herself describing her growing roster with unexpected pride. Besides Lily, she now taught 3 other children. 9-year-old Marcus, whose parents had driven from the next town after hearing about her work. Twins Sophie and Samuel, age 7, who insisted on learning the same pieces so they could perform. duets, and most recently, 13-year-old Jacob, who'd been studying with another teacher until she moved away and needed someone to continue his more advanced training. I never realized how much I'd miss the individual personalities, Margaret had said, watching Lily demonstrate her latest piece for the family. Each child approaches music differently. Lily is methodical, wants to understand the theory behind everything she plays. Marcus treats the piano like a playground. He improvises constantly. The twins feed off each other's energy. And Jacob reminds me why I fell in love with teaching teenagers. He's starting to understand that music can express things words can't. The conversation had naturally turned to Margaret's children. Patricia had always been close to David and Susan, serving as their surrogate aunt during childhood. Learning about their adult lives, David's expanding family, Susan's career in nursing, had felt like sharing joy rather than reporting medical bulletins. "Have you told them about teaching again?" Patricia had asked gently. "Not yet. I want to make sure it's going to last before I get their hopes up." Margaret had paused, surprised by her own honesty. "Actually, I think I'm afraid they'll worry that I'm doing too much, that I'll get hurt or disappointed again." "And what do you think?" Margaret had considered the question seriously. "I think for the first time in 10 years, I'm not afraid of being disappointed. The music is still there. The ability to connect with students is still there. Even if something goes wrong, I'll have had these weeks of feeling useful again." Now, sitting in the cathedral's peaceful twilight, Margaret reflected on how much had changed since that first desperate afternoon when she'd touched the statue's marble foot. Her weekly routine now revolved around lessons, practice time, and preparation rather than medical appointments and empty hours. She woke each morning with purpose, fell asleep each night with the satisfaction of meaningful work accomplished. Father Rodriguez appeared beside her pew, settling in with the quiet comfort of someone who belonged in this sacred space. "How are your music lessons progressing?" "Better than I dared hope," Margaret replied. "I have 6 regular students now, and Father Martinez from St. Joseph's called to ask if I'd consider starting a children's choir program there as well." "That's wonderful news. You've brought something special to our community." Father Rodriguez was quiet for a moment, then added, "I've been wondering, have you given any thought to working with adults? We have several parishioners who've expressed interest in music therapy, particularly for dealing with chronic illness or grief." The suggestion caught Margaret off guard. She'd been so focused on teaching children that she hadn't considered working with adults facing their own challenges. "I'm not trained in music therapy specifically." "No, but you understand both music and recovery in ways that formal training might not teach. Sometimes lived experience is the most valuable credential." That evening, Margaret called Susan for their weekly check-in. Her daughter's voice carried the familiar note of careful cheerfulness that meant she was trying not to worry. "How are you feeling, Mom? Any changes with your medication? Are you getting enough physical therapy?" "I'm feeling better than I have in years," Margaret said, and realized she meant it. "Actually, I have some news to share." She told Susan about returning to teaching, about her students, and the growing sense of community she'd found. Susan's silence stretched long enough that Margaret began to worry. "Mom, that's incredible," Susan finally said, and Margaret could hear tears in her voice. "I can't remember the last time you sounded this happy, but are you sure you're not pushing yourself too hard? Teaching can be exhausting, and with your condition—" "My condition hasn't changed," Margaret said gently, "but my perspective has. I spent 10 years thinking about what I couldn't do anymore. Now I'm focused on what I can still do." They talked for over an hour, Susan asking detailed questions about each student, clearly trying to understand this transformation in her mother. When Margaret mentioned her renewed friendship with Patricia, Susan's voice brightened considerably. "Aunt Patricia was so important to our family. I'm glad you've reconnected. David and I always wondered what happened between you two." "I happened," Margaret said simply. "I pushed away everyone who tried to help because I couldn't bear being the object of pity. And now, Margaret looked around her small apartment, seeing it differently than she had just weeks ago. The sheet music scattered on every surface, the lesson plans spread across her kitchen table, the phone that now rang regularly with inquiries and updates from students' parents. Now I think maybe being vulnerable enough to accept help is what allows us to help others. After hanging up, she called David. The conversation followed a similar pattern, his initial concern giving way to cautious joy as he realized the depth of change in his mother's life. Would it be okay if we visited next month? David asked. Sarah would love to meet some of your students, and Andrew is finally old enough to travel easily. I'd love that, Margaret said, meaning it completely. Maybe I could give Andrew his first piano lesson. That night she dreamed again of music, but this time she wasn't alone at the piano. Children's voices joined the melody, adult voices adding harmony. A whole community gathered around the beauty of shared sound. When she woke, she could still hear the echo of that impossible choir, and for the first time in a decade, she looked forward to seeing what the day would bring. The prayer candle in the cathedral would burn through the night, its small flame, a reminder that some transformations happen not in dramatic moments, but in the accumulation of small choices toward hope. The manila folder containing Margaret's medical records had grown thick over 10 years of appointments, tests, and consultations. Dr. Stevens held it now like something that might explode, her usually composed face showing the kind of bewilderment that made Margaret's stomach clench with familiar anxiety. I'm going to be direct with you, Margaret, Dr. Stevens said, settling behind her desk in the sterile examination room. These test results don't make sense. Margaret gripped her wheelchair's armrests. She'd come to this quarterly appointment, expecting the usual routine, reflexes that didn't respond, sensation tests that confirmed nothing had changed, medications adjusted to manage pain and depression. She hadn't expected her neurologist to look like she'd seen a ghost. What kind of don't make sense? Dr. Stevens opened the folder, spreading several pages of test results across her desk. Your original diagnosis was transverse myelitis, inflammation of the spinal cord that caused complete paralysis below the T12 vertebra. The damage appeared permanent, with no possibility of regeneration. I remember. You explained it very thoroughly 10 years ago. Yes, and nothing in your condition has changed clinically. You still have no sensation or motor function in your lower extremities. Dr. Stevens pointed to a series of brain scans. But these new imaging studies show something I've never seen before. Margaret leaned forward, studying the black and white images that looked like abstract art to her untrained eye. What am I looking at? Neural activity in regions of your spinal cord that should be completely dormant, not enough to restore function, but significant enough to register on our most sensitive equipment. Dr. Stevens pulled out older scans. For comparison, these areas have been silent for a decade. Now they're lighting up like Christmas trees. The room felt suddenly cold. Margaret had spent years accepting her limitations, building a new life around permanent disability. The idea that something might be changing in her body felt more terrifying than hopeful. What does it mean? I honestly don't know. I've consulted with colleagues at Johns Hopkins and Mayo Clinic. They've never seen neural regeneration at this level in cases of complete transverse myelitis. Dr. Stevens closed the folder, her expression troubled. I want to run additional tests, get more detailed imaging, maybe consult with specialists in spinal cord research. More tests. Margaret felt exhaustion wash over her. Dr. Stevens, I've built a life around being paralyzed. I have students who depend on me, friends who accept me as I am. What if these tests raise hopes that can't be fulfilled? Margaret, if there's any possibility of recovery to what? Walking, running, or just enough sensation to be constantly reminded of what I still can't do? Margaret's voice rose slightly. I've finally found peace with my limitations. Please don't ask me to give that up for false hope. Dr. Stevens was quiet for a long moment, studying Margaret with new attention. You seem different than you were 6 months ago, more present, engaged. I've started teaching piano again. I've reconnected with old friends. I found purpose beyond my medical condition. Margaret met the doctor's eyes steadily. Maybe that's what your scans are picking up. Not physical healing, but emotional and spiritual renewal. The brain and spinal cord don't regenerate because of improved mood, Margaret. Whatever we're seeing is real neural activity. But healing can take many forms, can't it? Maybe what you're measuring isn't the body trying to fix itself. Maybe it's the body responding to a life that's worth living again. Dr. Stevens made notes in Margaret's chart, her pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. I still want those additional tests. Even if you're right about the nature of this change, we need to understand what's happening. Margaret agreed reluctantly. To more appointments, more scans, more consultations with specialists who would see her as a medical puzzle rather than a woman who'd finally found her way back to joy. As she left the medical building, she felt the weight of unwanted possibilities pressing down on her shoulders. That afternoon, she had lessons with the twins and a new student, 10-year-old Anna, whose family had recently moved to town. But Margaret found it difficult to concentrate on fingerings and rhythm exercises while Dr. Stevens's words echoed in her mind. Neural activity where there should be silence, changes that medical experts couldn't explain. During her break between students, Margaret wheeled herself into the cathedral's main sanctuary and sat before the Virgin Mary statue. The afternoon light streaming through stained glass windows cast colored patterns across the marble figure's serene face, and Margaret tried to find the peace that had sustained her over recent weeks. "I don't understand what's happening to me," she whispered to the statue, feeling foolish but needing to voice her confusion. "For 10 years, I've asked for healing and heard nothing. Now that I've stopped asking, stopped hoping for miracles, everyone tells me something miraculous might be occurring." Father Rodriguez approached quietly, his presence a comfort rather than an intrusion. "You seem troubled today." Margaret told him about the medical appointment, about the conflicting emotions of fear and hope that threatened to undo the serenity she'd worked so hard to achieve. "What if the healing I've found, the spiritual healing, the sense of purpose, gets lost in pursuing physical recovery that might never come? What if it doesn't?" Father Rodriguez settled into the pew beside her wheelchair. "Margaret, I've watched you transform over these past months. You've gone from someone who was barely surviving to someone who's thriving. That transformation didn't happen because of medical intervention. Then what caused it? I think you know. You touch something larger than yourself. Call it faith, call it grace, call it the simple recognition that you're not alone in your struggles. Whatever's happening in your body now might be a response to that spiritual healing, not its cause." Margaret considered his words, remembering that first afternoon when she'd reached out to touch the statue's marble foot. She hadn't been seeking physical healing then, just a moment of connection, a brief respite from the isolation that had consumed her for so long. Father Martinez called again about the music therapy program. Father Rodriguez continued. "He has 5 adults who've signed up, people dealing with chronic pain, depression, loss of loved ones. They're not looking for medical miracles. They're looking for what you found here, a way to connect with something beautiful despite their circumstances." That evening, Margaret called Patricia to discuss her medical appointment. Her friend listened without judgment, asking thoughtful questions about how Margaret felt rather than what the doctors had said. "Remember when we were teenagers, and you wanted to be a concert pianist?" Patricia asked. "You practiced for hours every day, dreamed of playing Carnegie Hall. I remember being young and foolish. You were passionate and dedicated, but when you realized you didn't have the technical skill for professional performance, you didn't give up music entirely. You found another way to stay connected to what you loved, through teaching." Margaret saw where her friend was leading. "You think this situation is similar?" "I think you've already found your miracle, Margaret. These medical tests, whatever they show, don't change that. You've rediscovered your voice, your purpose, your place in the community. That's healing of the most important kind." That night, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a legal pad, making 2 lists. On one side, she wrote everything she hoped the medical tests might reveal. On the other, she wrote everything she'd already regained: the joy of teaching, reconnection with her children, friendship with Patricia, a sense of belonging in her community, the daily satisfaction of meaningful work. The second list filled the entire page. The first list contained only question marks. The concert program lay spread across Margaret's kitchen table, its elegant script announcing an evening of music and healing at St. Margaret's Cathedral. 3 weeks from now, her students would perform their first public recital, and she would play alongside them for the first time in over a decade. The prospect thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Susan's voice carried concern through the phone as Margaret described the upcoming event. "It sounds like a lot of pressure. What if something goes wrong?" "Then, something goes wrong, and we handle it," Margaret replied, surprising herself with her calm confidence. "These children have worked so hard, Susan. They deserve to share their music with people who love them." David had called the night before with similar concerns, though his were more practical. "Will the cathedral be accessible? Do you need us? Do come early to help set up. What about your medical appointments, the additional tests, Doctor?" Stevens had ordered were scheduled for the week after the recital. Margaret had insisted on that timing, refusing to let medical uncertainties overshadow her students' big moment. Whatever the scans revealed, whatever the specialists concluded, her responsibilities as a teacher came first. "I never thought I'd see you put anything ahead of medical care," David had said, and Margaret could hear the smile in his voice. "It's good to know your priorities are shifting in healthy directions." Now, reviewing the program one final time, Margaret felt a mixture of pride and anxiety. Lily would open with a Bach minuet she'd mastered despite her small hands. Marcus would perform an original composition he'd titled Rainy Day Blues, complete with improvised sections that made Margaret hold her breath during every lesson. The twins had prepared a duet arrangement of Für Elise that showcased both their individual skills and their remarkable musical intuition with each other. Jacob, her most advanced student, had chosen Debussy's Reverie, a piece that had been one of Margaret's favorites to perform before her accident. During their last lesson, he'd asked if she would accompany him on a second piano, creating a 4-hand arrangement they'd been working on for weeks. "I think it would mean something to people," Jacob had said with the earnest intensity only teenagers could muster. "You and me playing together, like showing that music connects different generations." Margaret had agreed, though the thought of performing publicly after so many years made her hands tremble slightly whenever she practiced. The muscle memory was intact, but the emotional vulnerability of sharing music with an audience felt overwhelming. Patricia had become her unofficial event coordinator, managing everything from publicity to refreshments with the efficiency she'd once brought to running the family bakery. "I've invited everyone I can think of," she'd told Margaret over coffee at Rosie's cafe. "The whole parish, plus parents and grandparents, your former colleagues from the school district, even some of your old students who still live in town." That sounds like a lot of people. It is. The cathedral holds about 200, and we're expecting close to that. Patricia reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. "Are you nervous?" "Terrified," Margaret admitted. "What if I forget the music? What if my hands shake? What if the children get stage fright and freeze up? Then it will be a beautifully human moment, and everyone will love you more for it." Patricia's voice was gentle but firm. "Margaret, you've already accomplished the miracle. These children have learned to love music because you loved them first. Whatever happens at the recital is just celebration." Father Rodriguez had been equally supportive, offering the cathedral's full resources for the event. "This recital represents something important for our community," he'd said during their planning meeting. "You've shown people that healing comes in many forms, that purpose can be rediscovered even after tremendous loss." The week before the Recital brought a flurry of final preparations and unexpected challenges. Marcus developed a case of nerves that made him play too fast, rushing through pieces he'd mastered months earlier. The twins got into an argument about their duet that required Margaret to spend an entire lesson helping them remember why they'd chosen to perform together. Even Lily, usually the most composed of her students, began second-guessing her piece selection. "What if people don't like Bach?" she asked during their final lesson, her small face creased with worry. "Then they don't understand beauty when they hear it," Margaret replied firmly. "But I promise you, Lily, when you play that minuet the way I've heard you play it, everyone in that cathedral will understand why music matters." Margaret's own anxiety manifested in obsessive practicing. She spent hours each day at the parish, all piano, running through Jacob's duet, until her fingers moved automatically through every phrase. But the more she practiced, the more she worried about performing from her wheelchair, about the logistics of two pianists sharing the stage, about whether her 10-year absence from public performance had cost her the ability to connect with an audience. Mrs. O'Brien noticed the strain during one of her regular visits. "You're looking peaked again," she observed with characteristic bluntness. "All this fussing over a piano recital. What's the worst that could happen?" "I could fail," Margaret said simply. "These children trust me to guide them through their first public performance, and I could let them down." "Nonsense. You think those babies care if you play every note perfect. They care that you believed in them enough to put them on a stage." Mrs. O'Brien settled into her usual chair with a decisive thump. "Besides, failing at something you care about beats never trying at all." 2 days before the recital, Margaret received unexpected visitors. David and Susan arrived together, having coordinated their travel to surprise their mother. Margaret opened her apartment door to find both her children standing in the hallway, grinning with the pleasure of their successful surprise. "We couldn't miss your big comeback," David said, enveloping her in a hug that smelled of airports and coffee and the cologne he'd worn since college. Susan was more direct in her assessment. "You look amazing, Mom, different, stronger somehow." They spent the evening at Patricia's house. 4 generations gathered around the dinner table while Lily demonstrated her recital piece and little Andrew banged enthusiastically on a toy piano. Margaret watched her son's face as he listened to Lily play, saw the moment he recognized his mother's teaching in the child's careful phrasing and confident technique. "She's really good," David whispered to Margaret. "You've done something special here." The night before the recital, Margaret couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the laundromat below, but instead of finding the mechanical noises soothing, she felt agitated by their repetitive rhythm. Tomorrow would mark either a triumphant return to the world she'd loved or a public demonstration of her limitations. At 2 in the morning, she gave up on sleep and transferred to her wheelchair. The streets were empty as she rolled toward the cathedral, using her key to enter through the side door Father Rodriguez had provided. The sanctuary was dark, except for the eternal flame burning near the altar and the soft glow of streetlights filtering through stained glass windows. She made her way to the Virgin Mary statue, that marble figure who had somehow catalyzed her return to music and community. In the quiet darkness, Margaret found herself speaking aloud to the serene face that had witnessed so much human hope and desperation. "I don't know what tomorrow will bring," she said softly. "I don't know if I'm strong enough to guide these children through their big moment, or brave enough to perform in front of people who remember when I was whole. But I know that finding music again, finding my voice as a teacher, that's been worth everything." The statue offered no response except its eternal expression of compassion and understanding. But as Margaret sat in the peaceful darkness, she felt something settle in her chest. Not confidence exactly, but acceptance. Whatever happened tomorrow, she had already reclaimed the parts of herself that mattered most. She wheeled to the parish hall and turned on a single light above the Steinway. For the last time before the recital, she played through Jacob's duet, her part flowing from memory while she imagined his melody interweaving with hers. The music filled the empty space with warmth and possibility, and Margaret realized that regardless of tomorrow's outcome, she was no longer the broken woman who had first touched the statue's marble foot months ago. As she prepared to leave, Margaret noticed a small envelope tucked under the piano's music stand. Inside, she found a simple note. "Thank you for giving me back my music. Tomorrow will be perfect because we'll be making it together. Jacob." For the first time in weeks, Margaret smiled without reservation. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would meet it surrounded by students who trusted her, friends who supported her, and family who had traveled across the country to witness her return to the world of the living. The Virgin Mary's statue stood witness as St. Margaret's Cathedral filled with an energy Margaret hadn't felt in years. Families arrived early, children dressed in their Sunday best clutching programs and flowers for their young performers. The restored marble figure seemed to preside over the gathering with her eternal expression of serene blessing, her presence a reminder of the journey that had brought Margaret back to this moment. Margaret positioned herself near the side entrance, greeting arrivals while her students warmed up in the parish hall. Her hands trembled slightly, not from nerves, she realized, but from anticipation. After months of preparation, the moment had finally arrived when she would step back into the role that had once defined her, a teacher presenting her students to the world. "Mrs. Brennan." The voice belonged to Kevin Morrison, now 24, and barely recognizable as the fidgety 7-year-old who'd once struggled to span an octave. He approached with a woman Margaret assumed was his wife, both of them beaming. With genuine warmth, "Kevin," Margaret breathed, momentarily overwhelmed by the sight of her former student. "You came. I couldn't miss this. Mrs. O'Brien called my mom and told her you were teaching again. I had to see it for myself." Kevin knelt beside her wheelchair, bringing himself to her eye level. "You changed my life, you know. Made me believe I could do things that seemed impossible. You were always capable of amazing things. I just helped you discover that." More former students appeared, now adults with careers and families of their own, many bringing their own children to witness their beloved teacher's return. Margaret found herself surrounded by a generation she'd helped nurture, their presence a testament to the lasting impact of patient encouragement and shared music. David and Susan flanked her chair, serving as unofficial greeters and handling the logistics she couldn't manage from her seated position. Margaret watched her son interact with her former students, saw him begin to understand the scope of influence his mother had wielded before her accident. Susan, with her healthcare background, efficiently managed the physical challenges of the event, adjusting microphone heights, ensuring wheelchair accessibility to the performance area, coordinating with Father Rodriguez about timing. Patricia appeared with Lily, who was dressed in a navy blue dress with a white collar that made her look both professional and impossibly young. The child's usual confidence had been replaced by wide-eyed nervousness as she took in the crowd of nearly 200 people filling the cathedral's pews. "There are so many people," Lily whispered to Margaret. "What if I make mistakes?" "Then you'll make beautiful mistakes, and everyone will love you for being brave enough to try," Margaret replied, remembering similar conversations with dozens of students over the years. "Do you remember why we're here tonight? To share music with people we care about." "Exactly. Not to be perfect, but to share something beautiful. That's all anyone expects, sweetheart." The other students gathered around Margaret's wheelchair, each dealing with pre-performance jitters in their own way. Marcus bounced on his toes, humming his improvised sections under his breath. The twins held hands tightly, drawing strength from their connection. Jacob stood slightly apart, his teenage composure intact, but his hands fidgeting with his sheet music. Father Rodriguez approached the group, his presence calming the young performers. "I want you all to know how proud our community is of what you've accomplished. You've brought music back to this cathedral in a way that honors both your talent and Mrs. Brennan's gift for teaching." As the audience settled and the formal program began, Margaret felt a familiar transformation occur. The nervous teacher disappeared, replaced by the confident educator who had guided hundreds of students through similar moments of triumph and vulnerability. This was her element, her calling, not just the music itself, but the act of helping young people discover their own voices through shared melody. Father Rodriguez offered a brief opening blessing, acknowledging the significance of the evening not just as entertainment, but as celebration of renewal and community. "Tonight," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the cathedral's excellent acoustics, "we witness the power of music to heal, to connect, and to remind us that our greatest gifts are meant to be shared." The program opened with Lily's Bach Minuet. Margaret watched from her position near the piano as the 8-year-old walked to the bench with careful dignity, adjusted her posture exactly as Margaret had taught her, and placed her small hands on the keys. The first notes rang out clear and true, and Margaret felt her heart swell with pride as Lily navigated the complex fingerings they'd practiced for months. When Lily finished to enthusiastic applause, she turned toward Margaret with a smile of pure joy. In that moment, Margaret understood that whatever happened with her medical tests, whatever the future held, she had already experienced the miracle she'd been seeking without knowing it. The ability to guide a child from uncertainty to confidence, from silence to song, that was healing of the most profound kind. The new business cards in Margaret's wallet read, "Margaret Brennan, Piano Instruction and Music Therapy." But as she watched each student perform, she realized her true profession couldn't be captured in any printed description. She was a witness to transformation, a guardian of confidence, a bridge between silence and song. Marcus took the stage next, his rainy day blues filling the cathedral with unexpected sophistication. His improvised sections, the parts that had worried Margaret during lessons, flowed naturally from the composed melody, demonstrating the kind of musical intuition that couldn't be taught, only encouraged. The audience responded to his creativity with warm laughter and applause, and Margaret saw him relax into the joy of performing rather than the pressure of perfection. The twins followed with their Fur-Elise duet, their 7-year-old hands, weaving Beethoven's familiar melody into a conversation between instruments. Margaret had worked with them for weeks on listening to each other, on creating space for both voices to be heard clearly. Tonight, they achieved a musical dialogue that spoke of trust, cooperation, and the kind of sibling harmony that extended far beyond the piano bench. Several other students performed, Anna with a gentle Mozart sonatina, 12-year-old Peter with a Chopin waltz that showcased his growing technical skills. Each performance was met with enthusiastic support from families and community members who understood they were witnessing more than entertainment. They were seeing children discover their own capabilities, claim space for their voices, step into confidence that would serve them far beyond music. But it was Jacob's performance that would remain etched in Margaret's memory. As he approached the piano for their shared duet, he paused beside her wheelchair and offered his hand, not to help her, but as a gesture of partnership. Together, they positioned themselves at the Steinway, Margaret's wheelchair angled so she could access the lower register, while Jacob commanded the melody from the upper keys. "Ready?" Jacob whispered, his teenage nerves finally showing. "Ready," Margaret replied, and meant it completely. The opening measures of Debussy's Reverie filled the cathedral with liquid beauty. Margaret felt her hands remember not just the notes, but the emotion behind them. The way this particular piece could transport both performer and listener into a realm of pure musical feeling. But more than that, she felt the extraordinary connection that occurred when two musicians truly listened to each other, creating something neither could achieve alone. Jacob's interpretation was more mature than she'd expected, his phrasing sophisticated beyond his years. Margaret found herself responding to his musical choices, adjusting her accompaniment to support his vision, while adding her own decades of experience to the harmonic foundation. The result was neither teacher nor student leading, but true collaboration, a conversation in the universal language they both understood. As the piece built toward its climactic section, Margaret became aware of the cathedral's perfect acoustics, carrying their music to every corner of the sacred space. She could sense the audience's complete attention, feel their connection to the beauty being created. This was what she'd missed during her years of isolation, not just the act of making music, but the profound intimacy of sharing it with others who recognized its power to transform ordinary moments into something transcendent. The final measures dissolved into silence that lasted several heartbeats before erupting into sustained applause. Jacob turned toward her with tears in his eyes, and Margaret realized she was crying too, not from sadness or pain, but from the overwhelming recognition that she had found her way back to herself. As the formal program concluded and the reception began, Margaret found herself surrounded by well-wishers, former students, parents grateful for their children's musical growth. But the moment that mattered most came when her own children approached, their faces reflecting pride and wonder. "Mom," Susan said, her voice thick with emotion, "I hadn't realized how much we'd all lost when your music stopped. Tonight I remember who you were before the accident, but I also see who you've become since then. Both versions are pretty amazing." David nodded, seemingly unable to find words. Finally, he managed, "I'm sorry we let you disappear for so long. We should have found a way to help you stay connected to this part of yourself." "You couldn't have," Margaret replied gently. "I had to find my own way back. But having you here tonight, seeing you understand what this means to me, that's a gift I never expected." Later, as the cathedral emptied and the students said their goodbyes with promises to practice hard for the next recital, Margaret remained near the Virgin Mary statue. The crowd had dispersed, but the sense of community lingered in the air like incense. Father Rodriguez joined her in the quiet, both of them savoring the afterglow of a successful evening. "That was extraordinary," he said simply. "Not just the music, but the transformation. I've watched you change over these months, but tonight I saw the person you were always meant to be." Margaret considered his words while studying the statue's serene expression. "I think healing isn't about returning to who we were before our wounds. It's about becoming who we're meant to be because of them." As she wheeled toward the exit, Margaret paused for one final moment with the marble figure that had somehow catalyzed her journey back to music and community. She didn't touch the statue's foot this time. That desperate gesture belonged to an earlier version of herself. Instead, she simply offered silent gratitude for the mysterious ways that hope could return when least expected, and purpose could be rediscovered in the most ordinary moments of connection between teacher and student, between one human heart and another. The family photograph captured a moment Margaret had never imagined possible. Herself surrounded by 4 generations of loved ones, everyone's faces reflecting the joy of deep connection and shared celebration. 6 months had passed since the recital, and the image now held a place of honor on her kitchen table alongside sheet music for her expanding roster of students and correspondence from the music therapy program that had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Margaret's teaching practice had evolved into something richer than she'd dreamed. 12 regular students filled her weekly schedule, ranging from 5-year-old Emma learning her first scales to 17-year-old Michael preparing for college auditions. But it was the adult music therapy sessions that had surprised her most. Bi-weekly, gatherings where people dealing with chronic illness, grief, and life transitions found solace in shared melody. "Music doesn't cure anything," Margaret often told the adults who joined her circles, "but it reminds us that we're more than our struggles. We're capable of creating beauty even in difficult circumstances." Dr. Stevens had eventually solved the mystery of Margaret's unusual test results. The neural activity hadn't indicated physical healing, but rather the brain's response to renewed purpose and social connection. "Your scans show what happens when someone rediscovers meaning," the neurologist had explained. "The brain, literally, lights up differently when we feel valued and engaged with our community. Margaret had accepted this explanation with relief rather than disappointment. Physical miracles, she'd learned, were less important than spiritual ones, and she'd experienced the latter in abundance. Patricia had become not just her closest friend again, but her business partner, managing the administrative aspects of Margaret's growing teaching practice with the same efficiency she'd once brought to running the family bakery. Their friendship had deepened through shared work, daily conversations, and the comfortable rhythm of two women who'd known each other through every stage of life. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd never gone to the cathedral? That day, Patricia asked during their weekly coffee meeting at Rosie's Cafe. Margaret considered the question while watching Jake arrange flowers in mason jars, his latest attempt to combine his artistic sensibilities with practical business needs. I think I would have eventually found my way back somehow. Maybe it would have taken longer. Maybe it would have looked different. But I believe we're all drawn toward our purpose eventually, even when we try to hide from it, especially then. The things we're meant to do have a way of calling us back, no matter how far we drift. David visited monthly now, bringing his growing family for extended weekends that filled Margaret's small apartment with the chaos of children's laughter and the warmth of intergenerational connection. Susan had transferred to a hospital closer to home, explaining that she wanted her future children to know their grandmother not as a patient, but as the vibrant woman she'd become. "It's funny," Susan had said during their last conversation. "I went into nursing partly because of your accident, thinking I could somehow fix what had happened to you. But watching you heal yourself, not physically, but in all the ways that really matter, taught me more about recovery than any medical textbook." The children's hospital, where Margaret now volunteered twice weekly, had become another source of deep satisfaction. Young patients dealing with their own physical challenges found in her someone who understood that strength came in many forms, that adaptation could lead to unexpected discoveries about personal capacity. Mrs. Brennan, 9-year-old Carlos, had told her during their last session, his arm in a cast that prevented him from playing his usual pieces, "You taught me that music doesn't live in my fingers. It lives in my heart, and I can always find it there." These moments of connection, of witnessing young people discover their own resilience, had become the cornerstone of Margaret's new understanding of her role in the world. She wasn't just teaching piano, she was modeling the possibility of thriving despite limitations, of finding joy in unexpected places. The Virgin Mary statue remained a weekly destination, but Margaret's relationship with the sacred figure had evolved. She no longer approached it seeking intervention or healing, but rather offering gratitude for the mysterious ways that hope could resurface when least expected. The marble face seemed to hold the same serene expression, but Margaret now saw it as acknowledgement rather than promise, recognition that the human capacity for renewal was itself miraculous. Father Rodriguez had been transferred to a larger parish, but his replacement, Father O'Malley, had embraced Margaret's programs with equal enthusiasm. The cathedral's music ministry now included children's choirs, adult therapy sessions, and monthly concerts that drew audiences from neighboring towns. "You've created something special here," Father O'Malley had told her recently. "Not just music, education, but a model for how communities can support healing in all its forms." On quiet evenings, when her lesson preparations were complete and her phone calls to distant family finished, Margaret would sometimes sit by her window and listen to the sounds of the neighborhood settling into night. The washing machines in Murphy's laundromat below still provided their rhythmic soundtrack, but she heard them differently now, not as reminders of other people's busy lives, but as evidence of the community she'd rejoined. Her medical appointments continued quarterly, but they'd become routine check-ins rather than desperate quests for impossible cures. Margaret's health remained stable, her limitations unchanged, but her relationship with both had transformed completely. She'd learned to see her wheelchair not as a symbol of loss, but as a tool that enabled her to do the work she was meant to do. The sheet music that once represented painful memories now filled her apartment like living things, each piece connected to a student's progress, a breakthrough moment, a shared discovery about the power of melody to express what words couldn't capture. Margaret had returned to her calling not as the person she'd been before her accident, but as someone deeper, wiser, more attuned to the subtle ways that healing occurred in both teacher and student. Late at night, when the world grew quiet enough to hear her own thoughts clearly, Margaret would sometimes find herself humming, not sadly, as she had during her years of isolation, but with the contentment of someone who had found her way back to herself through service to others. The music lived in her still, flowing through her hands to touch other hearts, creating ripples of beauty that extended far beyond any single lesson or therapy session. She had touched the foot of a marble statue seeking a miracle, and discovered that miracles came not in the dramatic moments of transformation we expected, but in the quiet, daily choice to remain open to connection, to possibility, to the profound healing that occurred when we allowed ourselves to be both teacher and student in the ongoing composition of a meaningful life.